Okay, so Answers in Atheism here with a talk with Dr. Daniel Nicholson. And let you introduce yourself, Dan.
Well, I am an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of George Mason University, and I just started there 2 months ago. Before that, I was in Vienna at the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research, which is an institute for advanced studies in theoretical biology and philosophy of biology. And I got a dual background in molecular biology, cell biology, and also in the history and philosophy of science. And I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, delighted to have you. So I hope we did a good job on reading your I think we read two papers, Is a Cell a Machine? And the other one I think was Cell Not Equal to a Machine. I can't remember what the second.
No, maybe the On Being the Right Size.
On Being the Right Size. That was it. Yeah, we did 2 parts, I think, for that one.
Yep.
I had the opportunity to look at I didn't watch all of it, but some of it, and it was great to see you engage so intently and in detail with the arguments. It was really nice.
Well, you know, I have to say that I really appreciate the way you took my ideas about the cell weren't very mechanistic, but they were very two-dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I think of a cell, I just think of, you know, just one of those little drawings maybe you do on paper, how flat. I didn't view it as this big 3-dimensional object with you know, really cold molasses on the inside, and the Brownian motion being the biggest thing, the biggest influence, you know,
right.
On it. And so that really helped improve my thinking about the cell.
Yeah, it's sort of a very, the conditions and the milieu that the cell exists in are very unfamiliar to us. And that was sort of the point of writing that second paper too, to make the case that a reason why we should be skeptical of drawing on analogies that come from our familiarity with machines is that, you know, cells just live in very different worlds from us. And so we need to completely reimagine how it is that they overcome the adaptive problems that they face. And you know, the same is obviously the case for the molecules inside the cell.
Yeah, and besides it being a machine that creates itself for itself and maintains itself until it doesn't. So it's not exactly like any machine I know.
Right.
My car did not develop from a zygote. Are we echoing a little bit?
I think you're okay.
Oh, okay. Oh, I thought I heard something. But anyway, so I was, well, it was right up my alley because for a long time I've tried to visualize the reality of what's going on at the molecular level. And I've always tried to caution myself. And then we have, you know, we have reductive science, right? Which I have for the last 20 years pushed against reductive physicalism or reductive naturalism. And I have sort of created something that is still very naturalistic, but I call it constructive naturalism, where you go in the other direction and you try to, you know, try to use the little pieces that we know about and construct. So, and so it's kind of a different view. So that was, and then around 2010, I ran into Terence Deacon. Are you familiar with Terence Deacon?
Yes. Yeah.
And that sort of thinking. And then I was studying neuroscience and also philosophy of consciousness. And I kind of came up through Dan Dennett, and for a long time thinking that it was 40 hertz gamma waves that, you know, was responsible for consciousness. And then I run into to Francis Varela and oh my God, Evan Thompson and the embodied mind thinkers, right?
Yeah.
And from that, I extended my idea to something I call enworlded mind, where basically I see my mind and consciousness as being a locality in the world, so that most of what's happening in my mind is actually happening in my body and around me. Not about half of it maybe in my brain and half of it out there and around me. And so I came up So anyway, so seeing your paper was very encouraging to me. And of course, we fight against ideas and creationists pretty heavily.
Right. So this is something you've been doing for a while. I mean, Danny mentioned briefly what you've been doing. So you have these streams, and you invite people to essentially discuss scientific ideas that can be used to counter the arguments of the creationists. Is that?
Yeah, and the other thing we do is we have these real raw shows called, you know, the Weather Report and Saturday Night at the Atheist, where we're just kind of a gathering for a bunch of atheists that want to fire back on the creationists. But most of what I want to do is present the story of evolution to the layman in a way that captures what I believe about it. You know, why I believe in abiogenesis and evolution, and why I am a naturalist and that sort of thing. And we get into all sorts of topics. I'm also one of those spiritual atheists. So I have a strong spiritual life, but yet I'm a strict naturalist and a hard atheist. So, and sometimes people don't understand how those things go together, but I think it intersects with some of the work you've done and some of the work that's being done in kind of looking at biology in a new way.
Right.
Yeah. So
it's very interesting.
Like Dennis Noble, you know, has a view.
Yeah, I know Dennis.
Yeah. And so anyway, you got into some stuff with Danny, and one of the things that you sort of just touched on briefly was normativity, or this idea of normativity in biology. And it's a little hard for a reductive physicalist to see what the heck we're talking about here.
Right.
But I thought maybe we could talk about that a little bit and how normativity fits into it.
Yeah, I guess what I noticed very quickly, that I think Danny had a different understanding or something different in mind when he asked me about normativity. I mean, it is a term that has different meanings in different areas of philosophy. And so that there wasn't really, I think, any real disagreement, because I guess I suspect that maybe he thought that I was trying to suggest that normativity, as it relates to human reasons, plays a role at the biological level, at the cellular level. And of course, I don't believe that. But I also think that normativity is a concept that can be understood in a richer way, and also that it has to be understood in this broader way for us to come to terms with how to make sense of it naturalistically. If we ever want to end up with an account of norms and normativity that is naturalistic, that is compatible with our best science, then I think that we need to think about it in a way that is not only anthropomorphic and anthropocentric. We need to think of the emergence of value and norms and meaning in nature. And I think that requires us to look beyond human beings and consider, evolution and where these come from.
Right. Yeah, I was reading a paper in the middle of the night by James Barham from your...
Yeah, I know James, yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things is that the problem arises from the fact that many commentators feel that reasons may be properly said to exist only where the capacity for their conscious weighing or rational deliberation exists.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and we're trying to extend beyond that.
Yeah.
But you end up in this loop sort of where you go back, and we know we have these reductive paths with which we use to explain or describe what is going on causally, that sort of thing. But the reality, I think when you look at real physical systems, I'm always confused when people try to find a singular causal mechanism, right? And I'm always looking to this network of causality which, you like, if you start out, okay, if the worm starts out seeking the bacteria and he pushes the water and the bacteria moves away, there's sort of a feedback loop, right?
Right.
So you're constantly feeding forward. And when you look at causality, you're trying to think of time and physicality as proceeding in like physical time, 1 nanosecond to the next.
Right.
The billiard ball bumps into the next billiard ball and whatever. And the way the systems actually work seem to be more in a swath of time, even though if we were to analyze it physically, we would only find that physical time. Yet when we analyze, when we try to understand what is really going on, I think we have to take a wider brush after causality. Do you follow what I mean?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So is that kind of where you're coming from with normativity, or do you want to expand on?
Yeah, I mean, I think so I'm actually quite skeptical of mechanism talk in biology, which should be totally surprising given my work on sort of what I call the machine conception of the organism.
Yep, not surprised.
Mechanism language is sort of pernicious and it can be quite misleading, and no one really knows what we're talking about when we're talking about mechanisms. There's a massive amount of philosophical literature on what mechanisms mean and what roles they play in biology, but that literature is sort of divorced and detached from a lot of the basic concerns of scientists. It's almost inward looking. You had a bunch of philosophers 20 years ago writing a couple of papers saying, look, we've been wrong all along about how explanations work in science, because the traditional view in the philosophy of science was that explanations appeal to laws. And it doesn't seem clear that in biology, that is what's happening. And instead, what biologists seem to be doing is using this term mechanism. And so a few philosophers 20 years ago wrote this one very famous paper called Thinking About Mechanisms, which I think has become the most cited paper in the philosophy of science over the past quarter of a century, where essentially they said, look, if we want to have a good philosophical account of mechanism, a good philosophical kind of explanation, we need to work out what this notion of mechanism is doing in biological explanation. And that's led to a huge sort of industry of graduate students working on what, the role of the concept of mechanism in different areas of biology. But what's happened is that eventually you had these accounts, and then those who started working on it after were responding to those accounts, and they became almost like neo-scholastic, like the account of this person has to be slightly amended in a way that became increasingly detached, I think, from the concerns of science. So, and what was missing, of course, again, here is a historical perspective. I mean, there is a reason why mechanism talk entered biology, and it's metaphorical, and I think that's often forgotten. We just assume that the cell is made up of mechanisms, and that to understand the cells, we need to explain how the cell works. We just need to identify the underlying mechanisms. And, I think that it's fine to use the term epistemically as a model that conveniently abstracts away a lot of the causal complexity and focuses on a set of causal relations that you can manipulate and intervene on to change the phenomenon that you want to explain. That's fine. But to ontologize that and to think that the world and even more so living systems are made up of their constituent building blocks are mechanisms is very problematic, because I don't think that's how biological systems are organized, right? So I push back against that, and but I guess we're veering off a little bit from your comment about. I just wanted to pick up on that because you mentioned mechanism.
Peter Machamer and Darden and
that's the paper. That's the paper I'm referring to. Yeah, Machamer.
Okay. Yeah, because I want to link all those in the description when we finally premiere this. So
yeah. So I wrote a paper 9 years ago called The Concept of Mechanism in Biology.
I do have that paper.
Yeah, so that paper is essentially me trying to work out how to connect that philosophical literature on mechanism with what I, with the history of biology and the concerns of in contemporary biology of mechanism. So it was an attempt to bring. It wasn't totally successful, but just because there seems to be, on the one hand, a desire, the scientists want to sort of come, it is important for them they want to talk about it. I mean, when I've attended, scientific conferences, I've often found people complaining, for example, that papers get rejected when they submitted to very good journals because the editor just says that the paper hasn't provided mechanistic insight, right? And there's no clear understanding of what mechanistic insight means, no clear understanding of how to distinguish really between description and explanation. And so there is, I think, a need to come to really understand what constitutes an effective explanation in biology. I'm just saying that a lot of the philosophical work that's been done by my colleagues, by philosophers of science, I haven't found to be sort of totally satisfactory. So that paper just tries to make some distinctions to clarify a little bit the terms of the debate.
Right. And there, yeah, you mentioned the two versions of mechanism, I think, in that paper, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what those are?
So I actually distinguish three senses of the term. So I'm a very historically informed philosopher of science. I don't imagine doing philosophy. I don't think you can do good philosophy of science without paying attention to the history of science. And as I specialize in biology, that means gaining an acquaintance with the history of biology and the history of biological thought, right? And so look at the concept of mechanism historically in the history of biology. What you find is that the term, emerges as a consequence of the mechanization of the world picture that takes place in the 17th century, right? That gives rise to modern science, where nature as a whole is reconceptualized as a giant piece of clockwork, and everything in it, as a consequence, also should be understood as a machine, right? So I've referred to that doctrine, that way of thinking about nature and of life as mechanicism, okay? And that is just the thesis that construes organisms as machines and everything that follows from that, right? That we eliminate purposiveness and final cause from what is acceptable in our explanations, that we think that the properties of biological systems emerge from the bottom up in increasing levels of complexity, that explanatory reductionism is the way to make sense of living systems, right, from the bottom up. And so on and so forth. And so that's that actually was the dominant view in the history of physiology, right, from the 17th century, from Descartes up to, well, I mean, it very oscillates with the vitalists, right? You've got this sort of famous epic dispute between the mechanicists and the vitalists about the nature of life that unfolds from the 17th century until the end of the 19th century. But from the 20th century onwards, the mechanistic view becomes dominant. That debate sort of fades out, and it becomes just a general assumption that we can think about life in mechanical terms. That's the way to think about it scientifically. So notice how successful the machine concept is, that it becomes synonymous with science, right? To give an explanation of something is to explain it as if it was a machine.
Yeah.
Right. And so to understand particular parts of biological systems, then the term mechanism is then used in analogy with machine. So I call this the machine mechanism sense of mechanism, where essentially you think of, you construe a biological system or part of a biological system as if it was a machine, right? With clear delineated parts that where there are clear structure-function relationships, right?
Right.
And then what's interesting though is that in the 20th century, another meaning, another sense of the notion of mechanism emerges in biology. So if you look at how the term is used today by contemporary biologists, the term doesn't really have any explicit connotations of machines. When we talk about the mechanism of natural selection or mechanism of,
right,
it's not obvious where the analogy with machines is. And even when we talk about mechanisms in molecular biology, it's again not immediately obvious, right? What is the analogy here? So it seemed to me that the term has actually lost its machine connotations in some way. It's become much more vague. And so what I did in that paper is try to explain how that happened, provide a hypothesis of how is it that the term mechanism used to mean something very clearly analogous to a machine, if you look at when we talked about the mechanism of the body in the 19th century. And by the mid-20th century, the term mechanism is being used to refer to a far broader range of biological systems and phenomena. And so I suggested that the reason for this was that the mechanistic view of life had become so dominant that we could take it for granted and it no longer needed to be explicitly defended. And so as a consequently, we could just assume that anything that exists in the biological world will eventually be understood in mechanical terms. And we did, the term mechanism didn't necessarily refer to that. So I found some textual evidence in support of this hypothesis. Prominent physiologists complaining in the 1930s that the term mechanism was losing its meaning. I thought, okay, this seems to be an indication that the term did have originally, a very clear commitment to an ontology of life, but now it no longer does, right?
Right.
So those are the three sort of senses, and the philosophical discourse, because it's proceeded ahistorically, has not really reckoned with either of the first two senses and has only concerned itself with that third sense. What did I call it? The causal mechanism sense, mechanism as picking out causes in the world that you can intervene and manipulate in a way that it doesn't commit you to any sort of ontology, right? And the problem with that, I argue, is that that sort of talk is epistemic. I don't think that when you look at scientific practice, there is any, when we talk about a mechanism, we're really talking about a mechanism for X. We're really talking about an explanation for X.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that.
And so that means that if that's the case, then it's impossible to really define, come to a very clear definition of what a mechanism is, if it really is some sort of model, some explanatory model, because it doesn't refer to anything in the world. So I think that's why there's been so much disagreement among philosophers about how to define it, because most people have still today in the philosophy of science assume that the term mechanism is picking out something in the world, just like the term mitochondrion is picking up something, that it's a term that refers to something. Yeah. And that's not the case, because if you look at any science textbook, any biology textbook, in the glossary, you'll find a definition of of lots of words starting with M, metabolism and mitochondrion, but you won't find a definition of mechanism, because it's not really a technical term. It's just a term that comes up in practice and has different meanings depending on the context.
Right.
But I haven't yet been totally successful in convincing my colleagues that that's the way we should think about mechanism, in a way that actually explains better why it's such a useful term. In a way, the fact that it's vague is good, because in particular contexts, you don't need to explain yourself. If you are in a lab and you're talking about exploring the mechanism of a particular phenomenon, the others around you understand you. What the difficulty comes is when you have someone working in immunology or in ecology or in evolutionary biology talking about mechanisms in those contexts and wants to understand what you mean, if you mean the same thing by mechanism when you're talking about protein synthesis.
Yeah.
Right.
So but there's this tension and part of the I think part of the reluctance to leave the mechanism talk is that epistemically we do, like I was studying the interaction of talin proteins and actin at the cell surface, right? To understand it, there is mechanistic diagrams and drawings and thinking that is involved in understanding overall what that process is.
Absolutely.
Even if statistically it's only statistics. I mean, if you were to look at the reality of the cell, all of a sudden it expands, so that in principle we feel that if we were to know where every atom is and what every atom was doing, that we could in principle create the entire story. There's that tension between what we need to do in order to explain and to learn the systems that are actually operating, and there's a reality to that. I mean, there is a reality to two proteins fitting together, right?
Absolutely. And to say that mechanisms are not real is not to say that the causal relations are not real. That doesn't follow at all. It's just to say that the language that we use to try to explain the relationships between entities in biological systems is referring to, it doesn't have to be taken ontically. Okay. It's just it's not, one does not want to be in a position to that one has to deny the success of mechanistic explanations. I mean, mechanistic explanations are extremely successful. What one has to do is to explain why they're successful. And I don't think that they're successful because mechanisms are real. Because if mechanisms were real, then one would be perfectly one could ask how many mechanisms make up a cell, for example. If you look one of these diagrams, these metabolic pathway diagrams that you tend to find, right? How many mechanisms are there in the diagram? Well, surely that's a sort of nonsensical question, because it depends on what you want to explain and the level of resolution that you want to explain.
Right.
That relates to the problem also of completeness of mechanistic explanations, right? So in some cases, an explanation at a pretty coarse view will suffice in particular context, and in other cases, you'll need to have far more details about the molecules interacting. The diagrams that you mentioned are a good example. Those diagrams are simplifying a great deal, the abstracting a great deal, and but they still constitute explanations for particular phenomena, because it's not necessary to represent in the diagram everything that's going on. You're always abstracting away a great deal, and you're only focusing on the sort of the causal connections that matter to how the phenomenon is brought about. Right. So I think that there are good reasons to say that mechanism talk is epistemic, and its predominance has historical reasons, and yet also recognize that it's quite successful. We don't want to say that it's not successful. It's not. It doesn't tell us everything, because as you pointed out, the statistical nature of molecular reactions is really not well captured by mechanistic explanations.
Right.
So that really doesn't help us there, but it has been extremely successful. If you look back at the past, half a century in molecular biology, it's been extremely successful. And it's been a good thing, right? It's just that as it always happens in science, when an idea becomes very successful, you forget that it's just that it's just a model. You confuse the model with the reality that is being referred to. You confuse usefulness with truthfulness.
Yeah, the day before yesterday, I got two posters that are 4 by 4 feet. One on molecular mechanisms in the cell, and the other one was on metabolic pathways. And I hung them up on my whiteboards because I had I didn't have room on my walls for them, and I had to get a magnifying glass to look at any particular part of it. Yeah. And standing back and looking at it, it's like, well, this is a damn fine mess. I mean, and then along with that, when you look at that, the problem is amplified. If you were to look at my cell, my particular cell, my cell that is turning cancerous or whatever, has so many other things that are not in that diagram, that are at play at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah. That's one of the points I made when I included one of those diagrams in my "Is the Cell Really a Machine" paper. Precisely what you said, that representation is, it's really messy, but even though it just shows how complicated cells are, that despite the fact that it looks quite messy, it's still an extreme simplification, because it only shows one possible way in which all those interacting parts can causally relate to one another.
Right.
Most of those proteins that you see in the pathways can and do interact with other proteins and other substrates in a way that is not represented in those diagrams, right? And the reason why I take sort of a hard line, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that they're just misleading. They just give us the impression that we understand what's going on perfectly and that we can control everything, because here it is. It's just like the circuit diagram of an electronic gadget. And they're being deliberately represented in a way that suggests something that is not true.
Yeah.
Right? And also it's preventing us from seeing the reality, which is that molecules do not behave like machines, right? They are much more plastic. They bind in ways for much shorter time periods, and they change their form constantly. So a lot of the reality of the cell is being occluded by these diagrams. It's almost as if, not only is it difficult to come to terms with this unfamiliar world of the cells, but we're making life even more difficult for ourselves by continuing to rely on models and analogies that seem comforting to us because they give us the illusion of control, but ultimately are just in the way of understanding.
Yeah, and sometimes we can effectively manufacture something and control a little bit of that. Sure. But then when it comes down to, I mean, if you're a person who has cancer and you're thinking, well, why can't you just look at my cancer and figure out what medicine to give me and fix it? And no, well, it doesn't work that way, because your cells are not the same as the cells
Yeah.
the guy that was in here 3 hours ago.
Exactly, exactly. You know, and also, I mean, in the case of cancer, you have again this sort of obsession with trying to identify the causes of carcinogenesis at the genetic level,
Yeah.
and sort of locating everything in one somatic cell. You know,
Yeah.
when in reality, you know, it can be the case that cancers can emerge as a consequence of problems at the tissue level, in the organization of the tissue, and so, you know, that to understand cancer, as with everything else in biology, context is fundamental, and that an obsession and fixation with genes, though helpful in the past, because we need to start somewhere, right? It's going, you know, we're reaching that point now where we're coming to the limits of what these sort of genetic-based explanations can tell us about complex phenomena like cancer.
And then in embryology or morphogenesis, basically,
Yeah.
looking at the genome as a blueprint for the cell is so horribly wrong. When you look into the mechanisms and the process of cell differentiation as an embryo develops, there's nothing that makes any sense
Right.
in the blueprint analogy at all.
Right, and yet is the most dominant way of thinking about development for, you know, since it was proposed in the early 60s, you know, for the whole of the second half of the 20th century, and even today. I mean, you find it in textbooks, and in of course the idea of the program has become more sophisticated. You've got, now it's sort of being replaced by this idea of gene regulatory networks.
Right.
But it's basically the same. And had the opportunity to talk to Eric Davidson about this before he passed away, who's been, you know, led the way with this conceptualization of the sea urchin embryo embryogenesis in terms of these regulatory networks, and he's completely committed to that same idea. It's just that it's a little bit more complicated because regulation, you know, because you need to account for regulation, so you don't have this direct output relation between the genome and the phenotype, but the entire ontology of it, the entire idea is just wrong. It's just not. It might have been. I mean, to say that it's wrong is not to say that it can't be helpful. Okay, in particular localized scenarios and contexts. Okay, but it is to say that fundamentally it's not capturing what's going on in morphogenesis. It just is.
Well, and the other thing is that the genome itself is only a very small part of that information. The information in the zygote and in the environment and everything around it, yeah, is also massively, you know, effective.
Absolutely.
Who
Absolutely.
did you?
I mean, I just want two things about that. One, so there was this very interesting mostly philosophical movement about 20 years ago, which emerged as a reaction to this gene-centric view of development called developmental systems theory.
Yeah.
Which is there's a nice collection of essays. I think it's called Cycles of Contingency. It was published, I think, in 2001 or 2003, and it brings together a bunch of people essentially criticizing the genetic program idea and suggesting that, you know, organisms construct themselves, and in fact, in many ways, one can go further and not just criticize the program, the genetic program model, but even criticize the very idea of information. You know,
right.
Where does that notion even come from? I mean, again, history can help us here. When you look at the history of molecular biology and you see how information was brought in, it was so accidental, and so, you know, it was totally unclear what that notion was supposed to mean, because it became very apparent very quickly that the original Shannon sense of information was inapplicable to cells.
Right.
The term was just a placeholder. It supplanted the earlier term specificity, which used to be used in pre-molecular biology to refer to molecular interactions. And again, you know, why should we even accept that information is something real in the world? This is a consequence of you know, the legacy of cybernetics. You know, those ideas were extremely influential in early molecular biology, and essentially succeeded in convincing several generations of biologists that we should think of information as something that is real, as Norbert Wiener said, as real as matter and energy. And so one should adopt a skeptical position here, not necessarily say, I'm going to, you know, it doesn't exist and we should eliminate it, but at least be skeptical and critical, and demand that when someone talks about information, about phenotypic information, or developmental information, what exactly is meant there? And what are we talking about, really? And is the analogy with information as it is used in communication systems even acceptable? Even is it doing any good work for us, or is it blinding us, right? So I mean, I don't take that extreme view, but I am totally sympathetic to those who take that criticism further, right, and say, well, we should even maybe dispense with the very notion of information, as it's not really doing that explanatory work that we expect it to.
Yeah, we're heading into biosemiotics. I get a paper a day on biosemiotics.
Right.
And still trying to figure out what the hell they're going to do with it.
Right.
No, it's like
biosemiotics is an interesting program.
It
I'm
is.
familiar with it, but it's sort of at the margins of philosophy of biology, at least in the Anglophone world.
Yeah.
It's more of a continental thing, maybe because its founder was a Baltic German, Jakob von Uexküll, who actually had some very interesting ideas in the early 20th century, but he wasn't picked up. His ideas weren't really picked up, at least in the US and in the UK. So there's almost a bit of a chasm, right, between the biosemioticians, who are most working in the continent, and philosophers of biology.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for them to impress me.
Right.
With results, that sort of thing. But I mean, it's just remarkably wonderful to think about and try to apply it. You know, the same with information. I did find a paper that had a really good way of treating the protein space in a Shannon information sense and coming up with an interesting measurement of functionality. But it was, but you know, and it tells you something very interesting about proteins. And you know, like some proteins, it doesn't matter almost what amino acid you replace, and you will end up with a functional protein. You'll end up with a protein space where 25% of everything in the space will do the same function. And that has a really, I think that has a really low amount of information in it. Whereas a protein that is completely has to be just perfect would have a very high amount of information. Well, that made sense. But you know, other than that, we the word information tends to reverberate in our brains and create and it just hooks up with all kinds of chaotic havoc with confusion over communication between human beings.
Yeah.
And you know, what is really going on. But I have a totally, completely harsh physicalist idea of information as being where things are in time and space, and where and what they are. And, you know, that, and of course, from that, you would look at the entire universe as this unbelievable mess of information. In order to specify all of that would be, you know, ridiculous. But
yeah, I mean, I think that the question there one needs to ask is, what is the purpose of those sort of theoretical reconstructions of information? Are you trying to capture how the term is used in actual biology, or are you trying to make sense of it in a way that doesn't necessarily correspond to its usage? Because it's, you know, you've had people doing this since the 50s, trying to come up with very ingenious ways of defining information.
Right.
But then the question is, well, what do you do with this? Scientists seem to be proceeding perfectly fine without this technical sense. I mean, in fact, it seems to me that the fact that it's vague and you know, that the term is plastic, it's more plastic, is perhaps why it is still in currency. It's not a bad thing, right? If you, as long as you remember, right, that its context, its real meaning depends on the context in which it is used, and you don't import all these additional assumptions about, you know, context independence, right? If you think that there's information in a particular molecule, does that mean you can work out what it's going to do without worrying about where it is expressed and when it is expressed and the partners binds to? So again, it's you know, and we can't avoid it, right? I mean, metaphorical language is everywhere, and it's part of the way science works. We try to make sense of the world by drawing on concepts and ideas that we know, to shed light on things that we don't know. And so the solution isn't to eliminate all metaphorical language. That's naive and just not practical. The solution is just to remember, at least, that that metaphors sometimes play theoretical roles, other times they just play heuristic roles, and not to try to infer truthfulness from usefulness in particular cases.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to capture is okay, if you imagine that we have a space that's filled with various colored dots, and they're just completely random. There is nothing similar anywhere between them, and then onto that space we have we superimpose two sort of S-shaped red dots, right, where we can see this pattern of these red dots in an S shape. And then over to the right, just a little ways, displaced a little bit, we also seen that same shape. So there's this tension between complete randomness and some sort of order, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Some sort of reproducible order. And there is a kind of mathematics, and it is statistical in nature, I think, that would capture these things. And I think that's exactly where where the solution to some of these biological problems is going, is capturing those homologous patterns across time and across organisms. And I don't think we have the mathematics yet to fully tackle what is going on, right? But anyway, that's where I would go with my completely physical idea of what information is.
Yeah, I mean, that idea is not that far away, as I understand it, from the first attempts, right, in the 40s and 50s to make sense of information and relate it to thermodynamics and to the notion of entropy. I mean, what's kind of interesting is that Shannon took entropy to be an information to be related in a way that Wiener thought was inversely related. So for Wiener, information is sort of the reversal of entropy.
Right.
And the problem there, of course, is that is there really a correspondence between mathematical theories of communication and thermodynamics? Because if you look at the literature historically, the language of entropy was brought in a very haphazard way as well. I think it was von Neumann who suggested to Shannon that he should use the term entropy in his theory, because that way no one would be able to criticize him, because no one really knows what entropy is anyway. Makes this remark, and it's incredible that people forget it.
Right.
That it's not at all clear or obvious that the notion of entropy as it is used in information theory bears any physical correspondence with the notion of entropy as it's used in thermodynamics. Right.
Yeah.
So no, I have nothing really against these attempts, the ones you described, to get more clear and what what information might mean. I would need to look more carefully though about how those sorts of notions can be used effectively to shed light on the nature of living systems. That's where we would need to look more closely at the details.
Yep, waiting to be impressed by the results.
Right.
Kind of where I'm at. What else was I going to say? Oh, who did you mention that you had passed away that did GRNs?
Yeah, he was this very cantankerous and very smart guy at Caltech called Eric Davidson.
Oh no, he's not with us anymore. Oh.
No, he passed away, I think, about 5 years ago or so.
Yeah, the Davidson Labs.
Yeah, and they had an entire army of postdocs that were trying to work out how the embryo, the sea urchin embryo,
right,
by doing massive amounts of experiments, knockout experiments, and knocking out individual genes, and then coming up with this very complicated an impressive diagram, which was again portrayed and represented deliberately as an engineering diagram.
Yeah.
And he seemed to think that that's the way we're going to. That's the answer. That's the solution. In fact, I asked him at one point. I told him what he thought about the machine, about the reliance on the question about machine metaphors in biological theory, and he told me there is no question. It's obvious. So I don't have anything to say, because that's just, for me, that's a problem that was settled in history. It was, and for me, that I was so shocked by that answer.
Yeah, yeah.
Just wasn't even interested in that.
Well, if you look at the diagrams that the Davidson lab produces, you might understand why he said that. So
yeah, I then understood, but I was just surprised that he wasn't even interested in. We were at a philosophy of science, conference in Israel. I was doing a postdoc there. And yeah, it was just not, he thought that was just not an interesting question because, I guess because he thought that, yeah, his entire research program relies on that being true.
Right.
So why would he be interested in questioning it?
But then if you look carefully at his diagrams, you'll see a whole lot of arrows and a lot of dotted lines that look more like suggestions than they do
Right.
mechanism.
Yeah, exactly.
His diagrams have caused me many headaches trying to decipher them.
Yeah, I mean, the main problems I see with them is that it doesn't mention context.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that can't be one way in which these genes relate to one another and the gene products, but to say that that's the way things work always, or not to recognize that biological systems are, extremely dependent on context, and that they're fluid systems. That there's no such thing as a solid circuit board. There's no such thing as wiring, or and that the molecules involved in these processes are being constantly buffeted by Brownian stochastic forces, and that they rely on statistics for things to work.
Right.
All of that is just eliminated from that picture completely.
I have a history in digital circuit design, and basically I looked in very seriously into some of the very early microprocessors, and even those things, you don't have square waves. You can't latch onto a square wave. You have a slope, and you have to latch on in the middle, and then you can make it reliable. But even those things are not entirely. A digital computer is nothing like digital if you look into the actual waveforms inside of it, right?
That's super interesting. Yeah, I remember an engineer once said something like that after one of my talks. He said, well, you talk about crosstalk between pathways. In engineering, we know that problem.
Right.
So it's sort of interesting that even in engineering, that's recognized. And it just comes to show how distorted the machine view of nature really is. To think that nature is mechanical is remarkable, that happened in history, right? That in the 17th century, what was previously thought to be totally different from what was mechanical came to be understood as mechanical. Yeah. And that we forgot that those two realms are totally different, and that machines are deliberately designed to work in a non-natural way. The regularity and predictability and decomposability of a machine are wonderful for us because it enables us to control them, but they really reflect what nature is not. And it's just incredible to me to think that modern science, the entire scientific enterprise for the past 400 years was initially based on making that leap, choosing to reconceptualize everything that we're going to look at in that way in order to make it more amenable to understanding and to be able to mathematize it and to give us license to be reductionists and to assume determinism. And so what you find, especially in physics, right, is that erosion by the beginning of the 20th century, that view has been eroded, that mechanistic view has been completely eroded, and quantum mechanics has made it impossible, at least at the quantum level, to even talk about determinism. And yet what's remarkable in biology, we've never really emancipated ourselves from those ideas. In fact, they returned. There was a time in the interwar period that it looked like biology would follow through and undergo its own sort of conceptual revolution. And I'm very interested in the philosophers and theoreticians that were engaged in that kind of work. But by the time the molecular biology revolution happened, that mechanistic view returned with a vengeance. And now we live in this sort of schizophrenic situation where the physicists recognize that nature is not mechanical, but the biologists think that it is, and the neurophysiologists.
And that's really interesting because a while back we had an interest in process philosophy and how it's affecting the scientists, and I bought a collection of essays about process philosophy and physics. Right. And I'm just noticing, I want to mention this for those who are going to be listening later. After we premiere this, you wrote a book, or at least edited a book, called Everything Flows, towards a processual philosophy of biology. So you're really trying to push people to think more in those terms, it seems like, along with several other colleagues.
Absolutely. That was the idea, to suggest what view of nature should we have if the mechanistic one is just not it's just not appropriate, and you don't need to make things up. I mean, everything has already been suggested. I mean, I don't claim any originality in anything that I do. I think that, for example, the critiques of machine thinking are extreme. You can find them going all the way back to the 17th century, and the same thing with this processual alternative. The processual view goes all the way back to Heraclitus, right? Pre-Socratic philosopher.
Yeah,
it's been at the margins. It's always been a reactionary position that one had to take to reject or criticize the dominant substance-based mechanistic view. And what we try to do in that collection of essays is based on a project that we had at Exeter in the UK and a bunch of conferences that we organized, is to think what biology could look like, what a metaphysics of biology could look like once we give up and we relinquish that old-fashioned and problematic mechanistic view, and what would it mean to reconceptualize biological knowledge in processual terms? To think that maybe the living world is not a hierarchy of structures or things, but a hierarchy of processes, and that things that look like substances are just very slow processes. There's patterns in the flow.
Oh, it's coming around. There are a lot of people that are interested, even in population genetics. Where we look at, we have the models, and then we have somebody like Lewontin that comes along and said, this model doesn't work, and that model doesn't work, and this doesn't. And they keep introducing terms, and then we start to wonder, what in the hell are we talking about exactly? Right. What is left? When you
Dr. Nicholson, you kind of pointed out in a video I found on the YouTube channel. Let's see, CNCS TV, that back in August of 2020, What is Life at 75, a retrospective evaluation.
Oh,
yeah, that was great. That was great.
I think that might have been, was that a talk I gave? That must have been a talk I gave in Mexico City.
Okay, well, it was Mexico City. I thought it was Spain, but yeah, Mexico City.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at it now. That was a 2-hour-long video, and I swear it didn't seem longer than 45 minutes.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
I was wanting more information. I was just wanting to know more about that. And you kind of place some of this. I'm going to use the word blame, but I really don't want to infer that too strongly. But you put the blame on none other than Schrodinger.
Yeah.
For cementing, I guess, the mechanistic view of life into our modern thinking. Now, you said there were contrary views all the way back to the 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, do you think that it is a bad thing for scientists to be so committed to their paradigms of things, their little pictures of things in their mind that lead programs and projects of study? Or do you wish people would hold on more loosely to their mechanistic versus stochastic or dynamic or fluid version of biology? Is there an ethical problem or at least a problem of bad habit in
that's a great question.
Resisting new questions and new models?
Yeah, I think it's sort of impossible to expect science to proceed in a way that is uncontaminated by metaphysical presuppositions. So a lot of early 20th century philosophy of science assumed that we could do away with metaphysics, right? That's the legacy of the Vienna Circle and the logical positivist program. But the truth of the matter is that metaphysical assumptions are always there. I mean, even the idea that we can do science without metaphysics is in some way a metaphysical commitment, a metaphysical standpoint to take. And so I think it's not realistic to expect scientists to not have those presuppositions. What's important is that we're explicit about them and that we recognize that we all have them and that they play a role in how we explain phenomena in the research programs that we choose to pursue and in the interpretations that we give of the data that we generate in our experiments. And as long as that's explicit, then it's perfectly fine to have certain people working within particular paradigms, if you want to use that loaded term. And the question is, there are going to be times when certain metaphysical assumptions are helpful and other times when they're not. And there seem to be, in some cases today, it seems that they are preventing progress. They are in the way. There are obstacles. So I wouldn't want to be in a situation where I'm telling scientists what they should think. I just want to make them more aware that they are already bringing to the table certain assumptions, even if they think that they're not. Okay, and I'm very glad that you mentioned that talk that I gave in Mexico, because that project on Schrödinger is what I'm doing at the moment, and I'm extremely excited about this. I'm actually writing a short book on revisiting what is life, because it's such a well-known book. Everyone has heard of it, and I initially thought it would be impossible to sort of say anything new about it. But I've become sort of obsessed with it. I've done some archival research in different countries to work out exactly what prompted Schrödinger to get interested in biology. And I've worked out a pretty neat story, I think, that explains why it is that he that he write about life. And that's what I presented in a very preliminary way in that talk that you
I came away with the impression, and you can correct me, but basically, were you saying that Schrödinger felt bad about the indeterminacy, the Schrodinger's cat mind game or thought experiment, and just wanted to get back in more mechanistic territory, so he applied that to biology and the cell. Almost like
that's basically right. I think that he was appalled by the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. He was appalled by the appropriation of his cat thought experiment. It's the most ironic, tragic thing about Schrödinger's legacy, that if you ask anyone in the street if they know anything about Schrödinger, they'll probably they won't even mention his wave equation. They'll mention the cat. And what's really ironic and tragic about that is that he intended that thought experiment to be a reductio ad absurdum argument. He suggested that argument to show how absurd it would be to take seriously this indeterminate Copenhagen view of quantum mechanics, because it would mean, right, that the cat would need to be both dead and alive until we open the box.
So he kind of fought to ridicule the quantum physicists by doing that. Okay.
It really was like that, and we have evidence because we have his correspondence with Einstein, and Einstein actually came up with a very sort of he was the one who actually gave him the ideas. He actually thought of a bunch of explosives. So he thought of the connection of the quantum scale and the macro scale could be illustrated with thinking of an explosion that would be connected in some way to some quantum effect, right? And Schrödinger said, "Oh, that's a really good idea." But he changed and thought of, and it's very interesting that he chose a cat, right, as an organism, a biological entity, to try to, Einstein and Schrödinger shared their disgust with Bohr's interpretation of quantum mechanics and his and Heisenberg's interpretation of his wave equation, right? And that cat thought experiment appeared in a paper that he published in 1935 called The Present State of Quantum Mechanics. It's a very negative paper. He is complaining and with the way in which quantum mechanics, with the emerging orthodoxy about how to think about quantum mechanics, that thought experiment was his attempt to show that it couldn't be right. And what was totally shocking and paradoxical and tragic is that they not only were they not appalled, but Heisenberg and others took on that cat and they used it as the poster child for
thanks for the poster idea.
Yeah, exactly. And so now we use that cat thought experiment to show the bizarre nature of quantum reality in a way that would have appalled Schrödinger, right? So what I try to say, what I'm trying to do is to suggest that Schrödinger was unhappy. He was marginalized he actually felt regret that he had even contributed to quantum theory, because his ontological commitments were actually closer to those of people like Boltzmann and his teachers in Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century. So he's sort of a classical physicist in just as, you know, Max Planck and to some extent Einstein also was in believing that physics, it was physics, there was the responsibility of physics to tell us what the world is like in a way that allows us to, you know, to think about it in some broadly deterministic way, even if it's a statistical form of determinism. And so when that quantum revolution happened, you know, and his own equation is deterministic. It's just, you know, the Schrodinger wave equation is deterministic. And so when the entire sort of community moved towards that indeterminate view of nature, he felt, you know, he felt extremely bad about that. And so what I suggest, and I found some historical evidence that suggested this is exactly what happened, is that he wanted to find in biology, okay, in genes and in organisms, a way to salvage, to rescue that mechanistic, deterministic picture of the world that was under attack in physics. And to arguments to suggest that actually in the biological realm, you know, those deterministic principles still apply. Okay, and
Wow.
so I can tell you, I mean, it's a super interesting story. It has to do also with the fact that some of Bohr's students, most notably a guy called Pascual Jordan, who was at Göttingen with Heisenberg, although he didn't win the Nobel Prize, but he was one of the people who developed matrix mechanics. Actually, Pascual Jordan was the first person already in the late 20s to suggest that maybe quantum effects could become amplified by organisms. He came up with what he called the amplifier theory, and he coined the term quantum biology. And he actually believed that, you know, that organisms amplify these quantum effects, and that quantum mechanics provides a foundation for indeterminacy and purposiveness at the biological level. And Schrodinger, we know from letters that he was appalled by this. And so in a way, he was prompted to write about biology in order to respond to people like Jordan and to say that, you know, quantum mechanics has no role to play at all. It may be, you know, especially in that indeterministic view in biology. And he was successful, right?
Wow.
About molecular biology and the 70 years that we've had since then. You know, it's Schrodinger that has been vindicated, not Bohr or not Jordan. It is that deterministic, mechanistic view that Schrodinger proposed in his book, What is Life, that became the foundation for how we thought about the order in the cell, right? So it's super interesting that this is just a historical sort of accident. It was Schrodinger wanting to make sure that that interpretation of quantum mechanics does not spill over into biology and also into psychology, because he was also interested in stopping physicists from arguing that our free will has a basis in quantum mechanics, that there's a connection between quantum indeterminacy and free will. And that's also something that Jordan did. So in a way, I will go even further, and that's something I've discovered after, you know, that talk I gave in Mexico, that biology really for Schrodinger is just the middle, it's sort of the middle point in between quantum mechanics and free will. And if you want to ensure that quantum mechanics in that indeterministic interpretation is not used to justify free will, the best way of doing so is showing that because we are organisms, you know, is showing that organisms do not behave in this way, and that in fact that they're deterministic all the way down, and that actually provides a justification for that determinism in the form of the covalent bond, right? The theory of the covalent bond is based on quantum mechanics, and it was developed by Schrodinger students, Heitler and London. And so in a way, you know, quantum mechanics does play a role in What is Life, but it's quantum mechanics in Schrodinger's interpretation of it, right? So it's explaining the rigidity of molecules, why it is that molecules, that the genes specifically, are not affected by stochastic forces, and that because of that solid covalent bond, they are able to withstand those fluctuations and preserve and amplify that order all the way to the macroscopic level, right? So the reason why I got interested in this, just to finish, I know it's a bit long-winded, but just to explain, the reason why I got interested in this is because I discovered that in Schrodinger's What is Life, I could find a reason for why it is that molecular biologists have been so obsessed with this rigid, deterministic, machine-like way of thinking about the cell, because that view is not inevitable. It's not telling us that that's the way we should think about it. This is a consequence of particular decisions and that were proposed and then defended, right? And that you can, as you put it, partly blame. Of course, it's not only Schrodinger here, but Schrodinger's arguments had a massive influence, I think, in justifying that view, because I mean, Schrödinger was one of the most respected physicists of the 20th century, and he's a huge authority figure. And so many physicists were inspired by Schrödinger to enter biology and develop molecular biology. You know, all of them mention the influence of Schrödinger. You know, you have Wilkins and Watson and Crick and Stent and Jacob and Monod and many others. So Benzer. So that's what's sort of interesting to me, right? That there's this ultimate irony that Schrödinger, as a physicist, succeeded in convincing several generations of biologists that they didn't need to reckon with physical forces such as Brownian motion in understanding biological order, that they didn't need to worry about stochasticity because the order was in some way justified by the rigidity of the covalent bond, right? That the Okay, that's a bit long, but does that sort of help make sense of what I'm?
Oh yes, definitely. And it just makes me wonder if, let's say that Schrödinger had like gone on vacation instead of done his work on What Is Life, and maybe wasn't as influential. Would we be having philosophers like you talking about how the cell is like a machine rather than stochastic organism?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have to, that's a really good question that comes up when we realize the contingency, right, of these ideas, that they could have been different. I mean, it could also have happened that, you know, if Jordan, the guy who came up with this idea of quantum biology, hadn't been a Nazi and hadn't been his reputation been completely destroyed as a consequence of National Socialist inclination during the war, that maybe people would have been more open to consider quantum effects at the cellular level in the way that they are right now, in the way that's happening right now. That's the really interesting thing about it. Quantum biology is resurging now. People don't realize that this is not new, that actually this was the original intention of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, to many of them at least, to suggest that to understand the cell and understand how molecules work, we would need to bring in effects of quantum mechanics, right? And I mean, I don't want to suggest that molecular biology would be totally different, because Schrödinger wasn't working in a vacuum. There were other people who were also suggesting similar ideas. But it's so interesting to me that this provides an understanding, at least a partial understanding, of why it is that we're stuck now with that legacy, with that view of the cell as a machine. You know, it obviously also has an older legacy. It goes all the way back to Descartes in the 17th century, but the modern view of cellular order, in fact, the very idea of the genetic program that we've discussed before, is already there in Schrödinger's notion of a code script. Schrödinger is the first person to use the term code in a way that is modern, in a way that is familiar to the molecular biologists, in a way that is pre-formationist, right? That suggests that everything that follows in development is already in some way preformed in the genetic makeup. So I think he has a lot more to answer for than people realize. And what's really striking to me is that even though a huge amount of work has been done on Schrödinger's What Is Life, and everyone's familiar with it, no one has actually made this case before, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I wanted to make sure that I was right, and I've done a lot of archival research to, you know, I found some letters, for example, of Schrödinger writing to his colleagues in Vienna in the early 30s, saying, hey, have you seen this new paper by Jordan on quantum mechanics and biology? I mean, it seems completely unacceptable. And then his colleagues saying, you should write something about biology. You should write something. And this is 1932. This is more than a decade before he would go on and do these What Is Life lectures. So he had it in mind. He carefully and slowly brewed over how to make that case for a decade before he presented those lectures, right? And then so an appreciation of that history helps us understand that there were personal reasons involved in Schrödinger wanting to defend this deterministic view of the cell, which he did very successfully.
Yeah, when I first started listening to the video, I was afraid that you were going to basically go along with the Schrödinger thing, and I was so pleased that you pushed back on it the way you did. So I don't know.
Now, are you going to write a book on free will now as well?
No. I mean, so it's a short book. I mean, it was originally going to be a paper, but as you've seen, I tend to have a tendency to write very long papers. So this became long. It just made more sense to write a short book. A little booklet, really, like around the same size as What Is Life itself, right? About 100 pages. That's what I'm planning. to do.
Yeah.
And essentially, it's I think will be the most comprehensive sort of survey of not only the the origins of this book, but also the reception and the legacy and how we should think about it today. It's fine to celebrate it, but I think what I'm going to argue is that we need to move beyond it. That's where we are now. I mean, in fact, that's if you think so. For example, Mike, you sent me that that recent article by Philip Ball that he published. So that's exactly the sort of view that I think we should that I think is going to become more dominant, and it's a view that is totally at odds with the understanding of the cell that Schrödinger was responsible for championing. And of course, one needs to be very careful, of course, to blame someone who didn't know any biology about things that with the benefit of 75 years of hindsight. But what I also do in this book, in the talk, I don't know if you remember, but I also try to suggest that he wasn't inevitable that he didn't have to choose to say that genes development. A lot of people were saying that wasn't a good way of thinking about genes already in the 1930s. And he didn't say that stochasticity plays no role. Again, this was well known already at the time that Brownian motion matters. So he made deliberate choices, right? He was very careful and selective about who he read and how he read the material that he did in genetics, right? So he chose to read, for example, the more reductionist geneticist of the time, like Hermann Muller, this New York geneticist, who had this extreme reductionist view. He has this famous manifesto paper called "The Gene as the Basis of Life" from 1929 that makes Dawkins look like a holist by comparison because it's extremely reductionist, right? And he was very keen to draw on him, even though he doesn't cite him in What is Life. And then we read people like Delbruck, right? And again, completely misconstrues the conclusion of that paper. So there's a lot of things that he does that suggest that we're not being unfair to him, and it's totally fine. I mean, he had an agenda, and it was totally justified in pushing his agenda. But to think that this is inevitable, that we should think about the cell in this way, as what he calls it, order from order, that all the order in the cell is a consequence of the order that is already existing in the genes. That is not, it wasn't, born by the facts either in 2021 or in 1944. It's one interpretation, and that's what I want to make people realize about this book.
Yeah, and that that article by Philip Ball also addresses something that I think is becoming obvious in abiogenesis and evolution, and that is that there is something much more stochastic going on than this mechanistic inheritance. And what we do in population genetics, there are all of these different species of molecules that are basically creating these new pathways, formulating them on the fly, that sort of thing. And it's sort of a new view, and it's kind of the extended synthesis of evolution that's coming into play. But I think science is on the right track as of in 2021, and I think we're starting to accept this wider view of things.
One thing that is I think very exciting that's happening now is this new interest on liquid phase separation. So the idea that many of the molecular structures that exist in the cell actually behave, they're not solids, they behave like liquids,
right?
And that totally, I only very briefly mentioned that in my Cell as a Machine paper, but if I rewrote it today, I would make much more, I would emphasize that aspect much more, because it's so exciting, right? So we got this new emerging view of the cell really as some sort of fluid system with the state of matter, the physical state of matter that we find in the cell it's really even unknown to the physicists, right? Even the physicists don't know what to make of how the nucleolus, for example, behaves, and and so you got all these physicists still today coming into molecular biology to try to understand the structure and the architecture of the cell. And what seems to be emerging is this view, which is totally antithetical to a machine view, because it seems to be suggesting that, physically speaking, right, all these entities in the cell, they bud off from each other. They have all these properties that we associate with liquid. So that completely challenges, if not totally refutes, these representations of them as solid state circuits.
Yeah, I've been doing some stuff with organelles and membranes, and
Yeah.
probably the best way to visualize a cell membrane is to look at a bubble in the sun with all those different colors flashing around on the surface, and,
Right.
you can see that it's a bubble, but it's liquid. You know, and when you look into the organization of the Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic reticulum, and all of that, they're finding all of these contact points and this interaction with this immense cytoskeleton, and it's all sort of flowing around. But I haven't looked into that liquid phase bit. I'm going to.
That's like,
you
I think that's
mentioned?
one of the most exciting things that is going to happen in the next 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And you know, yeah, go on. Sorry.
Okay. I guess we should probably wrap up pretty soon, but
Can I just say
hoping...
one more thing, Mike, I wanted to mention, which I think is philosophically interesting, is the question of where that leaves us with reduction.
Yeah.
Note that this view is drawing on physics. Okay, so one could actually make a case that it's a reductionist view, right? So, you know, rejections of the machine view are not necessarily anti-reductionist. They can come from physics, right? And so it complicates the picture, the story that we may want to tell about the reductionism, anti-reductionism debate, right? Because a focus on liquid phase separation or Brownian motion, when we look at life, would suggest that we want to adopt a physicalist perspective. So I think it's important to distinguish between the usefulness of physics versus the usefulness of engineering, right? And that maybe, well, at least for me, the bone to pick with is more with those who want to bring engineering ideas, even though it's not necessarily the case that they're all problematic, rather than those that want to bring in physics ideas. Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And that leads me to a question. Do you get hate mail from intelligent design proponents?
No, I did receive. I did get contacted once or twice by creationists, but you know, just to. I mean, no hate mail. I mean, it is
no hate mail. Yeah.
The case that they have noticed some of my work, and of course, it's not good news if what I'm saying is right, because it doesn't allow them to rely on machine language and machine ontology to make their case for design.
Right. Yep. Okay, so I'm hoping that we can have more talks, and I'm hoping that maybe you'll come onto the streams once in a while and chat with people. So
yeah, maybe yeah, we could do this again, and you can tell me when you're going to be meeting, and if I can get my audio to work, I'll be very happy to interact with your group.
It would be very helpful to have you in the side chat when this premieres, because I know some of our more frequent viewers really will have some questions.
Okay. Good.
Yep. Yeah, and I had another interview with Dr. Ben Golt this morning on Talon and a new idea for memory in the brain, or the mechanistic view of memory. And I suggested that the two of you get together and talk. He talks about machine code more than I think he should. And but anyway, I think you could have a pretty interesting talk, and he's right down there in the mechanism, looking at the mechanism, machine code. But it's that would be an interesting talk as well. Sure. So I got two premieres that I got to work on, and God, I hope this recording worked.
Oh, me too. Oh, I would hate to have to.
It would be so horrible if it didn't work, but it's
so. One more question, Dr. Nicholson.
Yes.
When do you think that your book about Schrodinger is going to come out?
Well, I'm writing it at the moment. I will probably submit it to the press by the end of the year. So I'm hoping that in the first half of next year it will come out.
Well, I'll definitely keep a lookout for
it would be great maybe to have another chat once you're able to
sure. Oh yeah.
Written version.
Put us in your book tour.
Yeah. Okay.
Or sooner.
Just to inform our whoever hears this, that book, Everything Flows Towards a Processual Philosophy of Biology, you can actually get it free on Kindle.
Yeah, I just one-clicked it myself.
But I know you probably cringe at the idea of people getting your books free.
No, quite the opposite. I'm delighted. What I care about, I think, as most academics, is that my stuff gets read. I don't get money anyway. So
well, you also had a contribution by Stephen Mumford, whom I have read in my attempts to just understand a little bit about
Yeah.
philosophy and biology and such.
Even is great. But actually, for this book, we paid the open access fee. We used the funding that we had to pay for it. So it's supposed to be free. It's legally free. Okay. It's not like, so we encourage everyone to, that's why we paid, so that everyone could download it for free. So I'm delighted that gets disseminated.
I prefer
and
my
the
books.
premieres will definitely put all the links in our description and make the information known to everybody.
Yeah, and let's work back and forth on email to figure out when we can premiere this. But
just let me know, and I'll be happy also to, if we can work out the technical issues, to join you for a stream one day. That's
yep, good.
We would love it.
So I'm going to end the recording, but I want to talk to you for a minute.
Okay.
Afterwards. So anyway, goodbye, cruel world. We're going to end right here.